All right, and we are back for our History 121 Week 4 lecture, Part 2. I'm now going to switch over to sharing my screen and get us back into the content where we left off which was with the election of 1800. So the election of 1800 was even more contentious than the election of 1796. The Federalists launched attacks on Jefferson, saying he robbed a widow and her children of a trust fund, and that he fathered numerous children with his slaves, which, as we of course know, turned out to be true in the case of Sally Hemings. They called him an atheist, even though he was a deist, and used other inflammatory remarks. Of course, due to the difficulties encountered by Adams during his presidency, Jefferson had many things to say as well. And there were a variety of different little skirmishes that took place both in the press and behind the scenes between the two major candidates. During this election, electors also had 2 votes each for president, and all but one voted for both candidates in their party. You can see here the map is essentially broken out by party as opposed to candidate. The end result, though, was that no candidate received a majority of the electoral votes, and the election was pushed into the House of Representatives because of the fact that Aaron Burr was campaigning for himself instead of Jefferson in the state of New York, as he was supposed to do. Jefferson would ultimately be chosen by the House of Representatives, and this controversy over the electoral tie would lead to the passage of the 12th Amendment, which also restructured having the president and vice president on the same ticket, therefore not leading to the Adams-Jefferson situation from 1796. On March 4th, 1801, Thomas Jefferson was inaugurated president in the new capital of Washington, D.C. In his address, he declared that all Americans were Federalists, all were Republicans. Essentially, they were a mixture. Jefferson pledged honest friendship with all nations and entangling alliances with none. Unlike his predecessors after Jefferson's election, he actually dismissed very few public servants because they were members of the opposite political party. But he was also very quick to reverse actions of the Federalists and pardon prisoners that were placed there due to the Sedition Acts. And he pushed Congress to pass the Naturalization Law of 1802, once again reducing the citizenship requirement from 14 years of residence to 5 years it had previously been done. Never a fan of the whiskey tax, Jefferson did away with it with the assistance of Congress. And he also made a critical choice in appointing Albert Gallatin as his Secretary of Treasury. Gallatin, like Jefferson, believed that a national debt wasn't a blessing. Unlike Hamilton, he didn't subscribe to having the people indebted to him, and Gallatin was quite successful in reducing the national debt. One of the other major issues that came up while Jefferson was in office was a result of one of the final pieces of legislation passed under the Adams administration, the Judiciary Act of 1801. It created 16 new federal judgeships and also ended up appointing John Marshall as the new Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And one of the other things that happened as a result of it was that when Jefferson took office, his new Secretary of State, James Madison, acted against some of the new judicial appointments, including Mr. Marbury, who was appointed to the Washington District. Marbury sued James Madison for his pay and his appointment, and the court ruled that Marbury had a right to his pay, but that the court itself, in addressing their own lack of authority against Madison, could not force Madison to appoint him to the position. Most importantly, the decision showed that the Supreme Court had the final authority in determining the meaning of the Constitution because as a result of this particular case, they said that the Judiciary Act of 1789 was unconstitutional. This particular concept is known as judicial review and has been an important component of our political system since 1803. What I'd like you to do now is take a moment and view the video on the Louisiana Purchase that is available to you in Canvas. The Louisiana Purchase would ultimately be one of the high points of Jefferson's first term, taking place in 1803. Robert Livingston, along with James Monroe, Jefferson's Secretary of State, managed to negotiate with Napoleon, who by that point had reclaimed Louisiana from the Spanish, to cede Louisiana to the United States for 15 million, which was essentially 3 cents an acre. Just prior to his reelection in 1804, Jefferson sent out William Clark and Meriwether Lewis to explore this new territory. They selected a Shoshone woman by the name of Sacagawea to act as their translator in what would be a very famous journey across the Louisiana Purchase and into Oregon country. In Canvas, you will see a handout which allows you to read 5 reflections on their experience. While they were away in 1804, Jefferson was reelected. He had replaced Aaron Burr as his vice president for reasons we'll talk about in a moment, and replaced him with George Clinton. So during Jefferson's first term, he and Burr were constantly at loggerheads, and when it was determined that he would not be reappointed as Jefferson's running mate in the 1804 election, he joined a group of extremist Federalists who actually were plotting the secession of New England and New York. Hamilton was the one that uncovered the plot, Jefferson's former nemesis, and upon Hamilton exposing this act of treason, Burr challenged Hamilton to a duel, and as history tells us, Hamilton accepted but refused to shoot and was shot and killed by Burr. At this time, Napoleon was also deliberately provoking Britain into renewing its war with France, and as a result, American trade sank as England and France, who were unable to hurt each other directly, resorted to indirect blows. In 1806, London ordered the Orders in Council, which closed ports under French control to foreign shipping, including American shipping, unless the American ships stopped at a British port first. Likewise, Napoleon ordered the seizure of all ships, including American ships, that entered British ports on their way to France. Added to this complication was the British practice of impressment, the illegal seizure of sailors and then forcing them to serve on British ships. Some 6,000 Americans were impressed between 1808 and 1811. The British claimed that they were escaped British sailors. This came to particular blows in 1807 when a royal frigate by the name of the Leopard confronted a U.S. frigate, the Chesapeake, about 10 miles off the coast of Virginia. The British captain ordered the seizure of 4 alleged British deserters. When the American commander refused, the U.S. ship received 3 devastating broadside blows that killed 3 Americans and wounded 18. Despite the fact that England was clearly wrong in this instance, Jefferson clung to peace. However, in 1807, Jefferson did pass the Embargo Act, which banned the exportation of any goods to any countries. With the act, Jefferson planned to force France and England, who both depended on American trade, to respect America and its citizens, who had both killed and captured American citizens. The embargo significantly hurt the profits of U.S. merchants and was consequently hated by Americans, and upon the election of President Madison and a new Congress, it was repealed. The embargo would ultimately fail for 2 main reasons. 1, Jefferson underestimated the Bulldog British and their dependence on American goods. And 2, he didn't continue the embargo long enough or tightly enough to achieve success. Even Jefferson himself admitted the embargo was 3 times more costly than a war, and he could have actually built a strong navy with a fraction of the money he lost. Britain managed to continue trading with Latin American republics, and France was able to continue supporting itself during the short time that the embargo was in place. In 1808, Jefferson continued the no third term precedent, and so the Democratic Republican Party nominated his Secretary of State, James Madison, who defeated Federalist candidate Charles Cotesworth Pinckney. Madison had served as the Secretary of State, and I misspoke earlier. I had bumped Monroe's Secretary of State position up a presidency. He then appointed James Monroe as his Secretary of State. That is Madison, by the way. Jefferson's vice president, George Clinton, continued to serve under James Madison, and this was an anomaly. The only other individual who did this would be John C. Calhoun. On March 4th, 1809, Madison became president, and in one of its first acts, the new Congress issued Macon's Bill Number 2, which reopened American trade with the entire world. However, it had a clause in it stating that if Britain or France repealed its commercial restrictions, then the U.S. would reinstate its trading embargo against the non-repealing country. Napoleon convinced James Madison to give Britain 3 months to lift its orders in council. Madison did, but Britain chose not to do so, and Madison had to reenact the United States trade embargo, but this time just against Britain. This decision would ultimately be one of the factors that would lead to the War of 1812. Under the newly elected Congress in 1811, the war hawks of that Congress were finally determined that they would bring themselves to war. Another factor, combined with Macon's Bill Number 2, was that they wanted to eliminate the native threats to pioneers. Keep in mind that the British were still supplying arms to the natives, including Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa, a pair of Shawnee brothers who had unified many of the native tribes in this area in a last-ditch battle with the settlers. William Henry Harrison, the governor of the Indiana Territory, would be victorious in defeating the Shawnee at the Battle of Tippecanoe, and down the road, he would use this as a rallying cry for his own presidential run. No longer able to avoid war, on June 1st, 1812, Madison asked Congress to declare it on the British, and Congress agreed. The Democratic Republicans who supported the war were known as the War Hawks, and they felt that the country had the right to assert American rights to the world. They wanted to invade Canada, the native stronghold, because the natives were being armed by the British to attack the settlers. The Federalists, in one of their last political gasps, were opposed to the war because they supported the British. At home this week, you will be doing an activity on the War of 1812, which actually lasts until the beginning of 1815. The War of 1812's most impressive byproduct would be heightened nationalism. The Army and Navy would also be expanded during this time period, and when it came up for renewal, the Bank of the United States would be revived. As a result of the Americans' new nationalism and also their surge in manufacturing as a result of the need to manufacture during the war against England, Congress also instituted its very first protective tariff, the Tariff of 1816. Congressman Henry Clay, building upon this, proposed a system known as the American System, which would establish the three components that are currently displayed on the screen now. Madison was actually not in favor of using federal funds for the third purpose, giving states aid for infrastructure, because he felt that it was unconstitutional. However, as we know, the nation would soon change its mind. In 1816, Madison decided not to run for a third term as well. And with the opposition Federalist Party in collapse, Madison's Secretary of State, James Monroe, had the advantage of quickly winning the nomination of the Democratic Republican Party and the Electoral College, beating Federalist Rufus King by a margin of 183 to 34. Despite some challenges, Monroe's presidency would be known as the era of good feelings, and in 1820 he would be reelected by all but one electoral vote, which went to John Quincy Adams, who would ultimately become the sixth president of the United States. In the very first financial panic that occurred since 1789, the Panic of 1819 occurred during the Monroe presidency. The main cause was over-speculation of frontier lands. The Bank of the United States was then hated by Western farmers because it foreclosed on many of the farms that had been purchased during this boom. Between 1791 and 1819, 9 states from the West joined the U.S. People were moving there because of cheap land, the construction of roadways, and many native territories being eliminated. The Land Act of 1820 also vastly empowered buyers to purchase land with only a cost of $1.25 per acre. One other major development during the first term of Monroe was the acquisition of Florida, which was a result of the Adams-Onis Treaty. This was brokered by Monroe's Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams. And as a result of this treaty, Spain ceded Florida, as well as Spanish claims to Oregon, in exchange for America giving up any claims to Texas. And of course, the poor Spaniards would not be the winners in that. With the rapid expansion of the nation, the issue of slavery continued to be brought up. And as a result of this expansion, the House of Representatives passed something known as the Talmadge Amendment, which made it much more difficult for Missouri to become a state. The House of Representatives were concerned about slaves being brought into Missouri and pushed for the gradual emancipation of children that had been born to slave parents already there. The amendment was actually defeated by the slave states in Congress, and a new compromise had to be reached. Henry Clay, who would ultimately be known as the Great Compromiser, introduced the Missouri Compromise. The Missouri Compromise said that any Louisiana purchased future states above the 3630 line of latitude would be admitted as free states, with the exception of Missouri, which would be admitted at that time as a slave state. To continue the balance of free and slave states, Maine would be admitted as a free state at that time, keeping 12 free states and 12 slave states. To close out this lecture, I just want to touch very briefly on three major Supreme Court cases. McCullough versus Maryland involved an attempt by Maryland, the state, to destroy a branch of the Bank of the United States by imposing a tax on banknotes. Marshall declared that the U.S. Bank was constitutional by invoking the Hamiltonian doctrine of implied powers. He therefore strengthened federal authority when he denied the right of Maryland to tax the bank. In 1821, in Cohens versus Virginia, the Cohens appealed to the Supreme Court after being found guilty of illegally selling lottery tickets in the state of Virginia. Virginia won, and the conviction was withheld, but the ruling further cemented the powers of the federal government. In Gibbons v. Ogden of 1824, issue came up between two private shipping companies over waterborne commerce between New York and New Jersey. New York lost, and it was ruled that waterways did fall under interstate commerce and therefore federal control. Once you have concluded watching this lecture, please go to our Socrative and take your Socrative quiz this week so I can verify that you have watched this lecture. This will be due by 5:30 p.m. next Wednesday. Thank you for listening, and please feel free to email me if you have any questions.